My final day in the home I loved was already bittersweet, but my meddling neighbor Brenda turned it into a public spectacle, accusing me of a crime. Little did she know, her malicious lie would inadvertently lead to her own rescue. The old house groaned around me, a symphony of farewells I'd been hearing for 35 years. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the empty living room, illuminating the ghosts of furniture long since sold or given away. Each scraped box, each roll of packing tape, was a punctuation mark at the end of a long, happy chapter of my life. My wife, Clara, had passed 6 months prior, and the silence in this big, 4-bedroom colonial was no longer peaceful. It was cavernous. It was a weight. So, I was moving. Downsizing to a condo closer to my son, Mark, and his family. It was the right thing to do, the necessary thing, but that didn't make it easy. The movers, 2 sturdy young men named Dave and Ricky, were efficient and respectful, treating my lifetime of accumulated possessions with a gentle care that I appreciated more than they knew. We were making good time. The massive moving truck was about 3/4 full, parked on the street directly in front of my driveway. It was a Saturday. The sun was shining. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something that resembled optimism. And that's when I saw her. Brenda. Brenda lived across the street, in a house so immaculately maintained it looked like a plastic model. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, the commander of the HOA, the neighborhood's resident thundercloud. For 20 years she had been a thorn in our side. She'd once measured the height of my grass with a ruler and left a passive-aggressive note on our door. She'd complained to the city that the basketball hoop Mark used as a kid was an eyesore. When Clara was sick, and I let the garden get a little overgrown, Brenda had the gall to tell me that my wilting petunias were bringing down the collective morale of the neighborhood. Today she was standing on her porch, wrapped in a fluffy pink bathrobe despite the 75-degree weather, a steaming mug of something clutched in her hand like a weapon. Her face was pinched into a familiar scowl, her eyes narrowed to slits, fixed on the moving truck. I knew that look. It was the calm before the storm. I sighed, wiping a bead of sweat from my brow. "Here we go," I muttered to Dave, who was maneuvering a heavy armchair down the front steps. He glanced across the street. "Problem, neighbor?" "You have no idea," I replied. As if summoned by my words, Brenda set her mug down with a decisive clatter and marched across her pristine lawn, her slippers flapping angrily against the pavement. She didn't stop at the curb. She came right up my driveway, planting herself between Dave and the truck, forcing him to an abrupt halt. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of venomous politeness she'd perfected over the years. "I think there's been a mistake." I stepped forward, trying to head off the inevitable explosion. "Brenda, good morning. We're just trying to get loaded up here." She ignored me completely, her eyes locked on Dave. "You can't park that behemoth there." She waved a dismissive hand at the truck. "It is a flagrant violation of Ordinance 7B4 of the Neighborhood Covenant. No commercial vehicles parked on the street for more than 1 hour." I blinked. "Brenda, it's a moving truck. We're moving. It's a temporary situation. We'll be gone in another hour or 2. "An hour is 60 minutes, she snapped, finally turning her gaze on me. "Your behemoth has been here since 9 a.m. It is now almost noon. Furthermore, it is blocking the view from my bay window and creating a public nuisance." Dave and Ricky exchanged a look of disbelief. "Ma'am," Dave said patiently, "we're just doing our job. There's nowhere else to park it to load the house." "That sounds like a you problem, not a me problem," Brenda retorted. "I have a clear and unobstructed view of the entire street, and your vehicle is an unacceptable imposition. I want it moved. Now." My own patience, already worn thin by the emotional toll of the day, began to fray. "Brenda, be reasonable. We are leaving. Permanently. In a couple of hours you will have your unobstructed view back for the rest of your life. Can you please just let us finish?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of something truly nasty crossing her face. "Don't you take that tone with me, Robert. I knew you were letting this place go to ruin after Clara. Well, you know. But I will not have you and your hired ruffians disrupting the peace and quiet of my Saturday morning. Move the truck, or I will be forced to take official action." "Official action? I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "What are you going to do?" "Call the HOA on me for moving out." A sly, triumphant smile spread across her lips. It was a chilling sight. "No, Robert," she said, pulling a cell phone from the pocket of her bathrobe. "I'm going to call the police. I'll tell them there's a suspicious vehicle casing the neighborhood, and that the owner of the property is being belligerent and uncooperative." My blood ran cold. She wouldn't. She couldn't be that vile. But as I watched her dial the 3 numbers, her thumb stabbing at the screen with vindictive glee, I knew she could. She was actually doing it. She was calling the cops on a 65-year-old widower for moving out of his own home. 15 minutes later, 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, pulled up behind the moving truck. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions grim and professional. Brenda immediately rushed over to them, launching into a dramatic, tear-filled performance about how she felt threatened, how we were blocking the street illegally, and how I had verbally accosted her. I stood there, dumbfounded, watching this woman weave a web of complete and utter fiction. The lead officer, a man with a stern face and a thick mustache, listened to her entire sob story, nodding occasionally. Then he turned and walked toward me, his partner flanking him. My heart pounded in my chest. This couldn't be happening. Dave and Ricky had stopped working, just watching the absurd drama unfold. The officer stopped a few feet in front of me, his hand resting on his hip, just inches from his sidearm. He looked from me to the house, then back to Brenda, who was watching with an expression of pure, unadulterated victory. And then he spoke, his voice low and serious, sending a jolt of pure ice through my veins. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle. We've received a report of a potential burglary in progress." "Burglary?" The word came out as a strangled laugh. "Officer, you can't be serious. This is my house. I've lived here for 35 years. I'm moving out." I gestured wildly with my hands, pointing at the empty windows, the stacks of labeled boxes on the lawn, the 2 movers who were now staring with their mouths agape. "Does this look like a burglary to you?" Brenda, smelling blood in the water, scurried closer to the officers. "That's what he wants you to think," she chirped, her voice trembling with faux fear. He became incredibly hostile when I questioned the strange truck, shouting at me, "Officer, I'm an elderly woman, all alone. I was terrified he was going to do something." The officer with the mustache held up a hand to silence her, though his eyes remained fixed on me. "Sir, I understand this may be a misunderstanding, but we have to follow procedure. Do you have identification on you?" "Something with this address on it?" My heart sank. My wallet. Where was my wallet? I patted my jeans pockets. Empty. My jacket was draped over a box inside the front door. I must have put it in an essentials box when I changed into my work clothes this morning. A box that was now likely buried deep in the cavernous belly of the moving truck. My wallet. "I think it's packed," I stammered, feeling a flush of heat creep up my neck. The absurdity of it was suffocating. I was being treated like a squatter on my own property. But look around. The family photos are gone from the walls. The kitchen is empty. Ask Dave and Ricky, the movers. They've been here all morning. The officer glanced at the movers, who both nodded vigorously. "He's the owner, sir," Dave said. "We've got the contract and everything." "I'd like to see that contract," the officer said, his tone unwavering. Dave's face fell. "It's in the cab of the truck, along with our own IDs." "Well, no one is going near that truck until we get this sorted out," the officer stated flatly. He turned to his partner. "Run the plates on the truck and the car in the driveway. Then back to me. Sir, for now, I need you to stay right here on the lawn. Do not enter the house or the truck." I felt a surge of helpless rage. We were losing time. I was paying these men by the hour. Every minute this ridiculous charade continued was costing me money and fraying my last nerve. Brenda stood on the sidelines, arms crossed, radiating a smug satisfaction that was almost physically painful to witness. She had won. She had taken my last day in my home, a day already fraught with sadness and stress, and turned it into a public spectacle, a nightmare of her own making. I looked at the stern faces of the officers, at the flashing lights painting stripes across my lawn, at the growing number of curious neighbors peering out their windows. I was powerless, a suspect in my own life story. And then a thought broke through the fog of my anger. Mark. My son. Mark. He wasn't just my son. He was the reason I was moving, the reason I had any hope for the future. He was also a sheriff's deputy in the next county over. He knew the law. He knew how to handle people like Brenda. I hated to bother him at work, but this situation had spiraled far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. "Officer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My son, he can verify who I am. He's a sheriff's deputy. May I please call him?" The mustached officer considered this for a moment, his eyes searching my face. I must have looked as desperate and defeated as I felt. "All right," he conceded. "Make the call, on speaker." I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking slightly. I found Mark's number and hit dial, pressing the speakerphone icon. It rang twice before he picked up. "Hey, Dad, everything okay? Aren't you supposed to be in the middle of the move?" Mark's familiar, steady voice was a balm to my frayed nerves. "Mark, listen," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I have a situation here. Brenda from across the street. She called the cops on me." "She... what?" The calm in his voice vanished, replaced by sharp concern. "Why? What happened?" "She said the moving truck was a nuisance. When I wouldn't move it, she told the police we were robbing the house." A string of curses came through the phone, so uncharacteristic of Mark that the officers exchanged a glance. "Are you kidding me? Dad, are you all right? Are the cops there now?" "Yes, son, they're here. They won't let us continue loading the truck. They think I'm a burglar. I can't find my wallet to prove who I am." Okay. Stay calm, Dad. Don't say anything else to them. I'm on my way. I can be there in 20 minutes. Just hang tight. I'll handle this." The line went dead. I looked at the officers. "He's coming," I said quietly. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. The officers stood stoically. Brenda paced on her lawn, occasionally shouting things like, "Make sure you check for warrants." My movers sat on the curb, looking dejected. The whole situation felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake from. The second officer came back and confirmed the car in the driveway was registered to me, Robert Miller, at this address. It helped, but the lead officer still looked skeptical, poisoned by Brenda's dramatic performance. "Doesn't prove you're Robert Miller," he grunted. Just as my hope was starting to fade completely, a new vehicle turned onto our quiet cul-de-sac. It wasn't a standard patrol car. It was a dark gray, unmarked Ford SUV, but it had a purposeful, official look to it. It slowed and pulled up behind the second police car, parking at an angle that blocked Brenda's view of the scene. The driver's side door opened. A tall man in a crisp, tan sheriff's uniform stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. On his sleeve was the patch of the county sheriff's department. On his belt was a holstered firearm, a taser, and a pair of shiny silver handcuffs. He put on his flat-brimmed hat, adjusted his duty belt, and turned. It was Mark, my son. His face was a thundercloud, his jaw set in a line of pure, controlled fury. The two patrol officers straightened up immediately, their demeanor shifting from suspicion to professional courtesy. Brenda, however, didn't recognize him at first. All she saw was another, more authoritative officer arriving at the scene she had created. A smug, triumphant smile spread across her face as she scurried towards him. "Oh, thank heavens, a sheriff is here," she gushed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You have to help. That man over there." Mark didn't even look at her. His eyes, cold as steel, were locked on mine. And then he walked right past her, past the two local cops, and stopped directly in front of me. The tension on the street was thick enough to cut with a knife. He looked me up and down, taking in my stressed expression and dusty clothes, and a flicker of warmth entered his eyes. Then he turned his head slowly, deliberately, and finally fixed his gaze on a stunned and confused Brenda. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with absolute authority. "Ma'am," he began, his tone dangerously calm. "Start talking. Tell me exactly what you said to the 911 dispatcher. Every single word." Brenda froze, her mouth slightly agape. The triumphant glee drained from her face, replaced by a flicker of confusion, and then a dawning unease. This wasn't going according to her script. The sheriff wasn't fawning over her tale of woe. He was looking at her like she was a bug he was contemplating squashing. "Well, I told them what was happening," she stammered, gesturing back toward me. "I reported a suspicious vehicle, possibly casing the neighborhood for a burglary. And when I confronted this man," she pointed at me again, her voice regaining a little of its shrillness, "he became belligerent. I felt threatened." Mark took a slow, deliberate step towards her. The two local officers shifted their weight, suddenly looking very interested in the conversation. They were no longer in charge here. Protocol dictated they defer to the higher-ranking officer, especially one who had arrived with such clear and personal authority. "You felt threatened," Mark repeated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He glanced over his shoulder at me, a 65-year-old man in a paint-splattered T-shirt, and then back at her. "By my father?" The penny finally dropped. Brenda's eyes widened in horrified recognition. Her face, already pale, turned a ghostly shade of white. Your father," she squeaked, the words barely audible. "Mark? Little Mark Miller? You're a sheriff?" "Deputy Sheriff Mark Miller," he corrected her, his tone as cold as a winter morning. "And yes, that is my father, Robert Miller. The man you just accused of being a burglar in his own home. The home he is being forced to leave because every corner of it reminds him of his wife, my mother, who passed away 6 months ago." A wave of shame so profound it was almost visible washed over Brenda. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but she was pinned by Mark's unyielding gaze. Several neighbors who had been watching from their porches now began to murmur amongst themselves. The narrative had shifted dramatically. Mark wasn't finished. He turned to the two city police officers. "Officers, I apologize for my father's lack of identification. He's been under a lot of stress. I can personally vouch for his identity. My own ID is in my vehicle, and I trust you'll find that sufficient." The mustached officer nodded quickly. "Of course, Deputy Miller, no problem at all. This appears to be a big misunderstanding." He shot a venomous glare at Brenda, who seemed to shrink under the weight of it. "Oh, it's a misunderstanding, all right," Mark said, his voice dropping to a low growl as he turned his full attention back to Brenda. "But it's one with consequences. Ma'am, do you know the penalty for filing a false police report in this state?" Brenda began to tremble. I was just concerned. For the safety of the neighborhood. I didn't know it was him. I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Mark took another step closer, his 6'2" frame towering over her. "You've lived across the street from my father for 20 years. You knew exactly who he was. You knew my mother was gone. You knew he was moving today. You saw the moving truck, you saw him carrying boxes, but you decided to use the police as your personal cudgel to bully a grieving senior citizen because you didn't like where the truck was parked. You didn't just file a report, you lied. You told the dispatcher he was belligerent and that you were threatened. You intentionally escalated this situation, wasting city resources and putting my father through incredible distress. That's not being a concerned citizen, ma'am. That's abuse of the 911 system. It's a crime." He let the word crime hang in the air, heavy and sharp. Brenda's face crumpled. "Now please," she whimpered, tears welling in her eyes. Real tears this time, tears of fear, not of crocodile manipulation. "It was a mistake. I'm sorry." "It's a little late for sorry," Mark said coolly. He looked at the local officers. "I'd like a copy of the 911 call recording for my report." He then turned back to Brenda, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he was just going to leave it at that, having thoroughly humiliated her in front of the entire neighborhood. I almost hoped he would. Seeing her crumble like this was satisfying, but also deeply pathetic. But Mark's sense of justice was as sharp and unyielding as his demeanor. He wasn't just my son. He was an officer of the law, and Brenda had broken it. He reached for his radio, his thumb hovering over the button. The entire cul-de-sac held its breath. Brenda watched him, her eyes wide with terror. He was actually going to pursue this. He was going to press charges. The public humiliation was just the beginning. Then he lowered the radio. A flicker of something pity, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion crossed his face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, a trembling, pathetic woman in a pink bathrobe. "You know what?" he said, his voice now quiet, almost conversational. "My dad has had a hard enough day. The last thing he needs is to be a witness in a court case against his lunatic neighbor. So here's what's going to happen." Brenda nodded frantically, ready to agree to anything. "You are going to go back into your house," Mark instructed, pointing a stern finger at her front door. "You're going to stay there. You're not going to speak to my father again. Not today, not ever. If I so much as hear that you've looked at his movers the wrong way for the rest of the day, I will come back. And when I do," he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, "I won't be as understanding. Are we clear?" "Yes, crystal clear. Thank you, officer. Thank you," she babbled, turning to scurry back across the street. "I'm not finished." Mark's voice cracked like a whip, and she froze mid-step. He walked to the back of his SUV, opened the rear door, and pulled something out. It was large, metallic, and distinctly shaped. He walked back towards the lawn, carrying it with an ease that belied its weight. It was a heavy-duty, commercial-grade snow shovel. He stopped not in front of Brenda, but in front of Dave and Ricky, who were still sitting on the curb, watching the entire exchange with a mixture of awe and amusement. "Gentlemen," Mark said, his professional tone returning, "my deepest apologies for the delay and the ridiculous interruption. Please add another 2 hours to my father's bill. It's the least we can do." He then turned and addressed the entire cul-de-sac, his voice booming with authority. "All right, show's over, folks. Let's give these people some space to work." The neighbors quickly dispersed, doors closing and blinds snapping shut. The 2 police officers gave Mark a respectful nod, got back in their cars, and drove away. The flashing lights were gone. The tension was gone. It was just me, my son, and the movers on a quiet street. I walked over to Mark and clapped him on the shoulder, my throat thick with emotion. "Thank you, son. I don't know what I would have done." He gave me a tired smile. "Anytime, Dad." He looked over at the moving truck. "All right, let's get this show on the road. We're burning daylight." He handed the snow shovel to a bewildered-looking Dave. "Here, thought this might help with any remaining obstructions." Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the newfound peace. It came from across the street. From Brenda's house. It wasn't a shriek of anger or frustration. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Mark and I spun around, our eyes locking on her front window. Through the glass we could see her, her face a mask of horror, her finger pointing frantically. Not at us, but at something behind her, something inside her own pristine living room. And then we saw it, too. A dark shape moving, a window sliding open. Someone was in her house. For a split second the world stood still. The quiet cul-de-sac, which had just been the stage for a petty drama, was now the scene of a real one. Brenda's shriek echoed in the sudden silence, a raw, primal sound of fear. My son, Mark, didn't hesitate. His training, his very nature, kicked in. The tired son was gone, and the sheriff's deputy was back in full command. "Dad, get back. Call 911. Tell them active burglary, possible hostage situation," he ordered, his voice sharp and clear. He was already moving, his hand unholstering his firearm as he sprinted across the street. "Dave, Ricky, stay with my father. Keep your distance." I fumbled for my phone again, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline as I relayed the information to the dispatcher. The same dispatcher I'd likely spoken to less than an hour ago. The irony was staggering. While Brenda was crying wolf about a fake burglary at my house, a real one was happening in hers. Mark reached her front porch in seconds. He didn't charge in. He flattened himself against the wall next to the large bay window, his weapon held in a ready position, his eyes scanning, assessing. Brenda was still visible through the glass, frozen in terror, her back pressed against the far wall. The dark shape Mark and I had seen was now a man, dressed in black, his face obscured by a ski mask. He was yanking a flat-screen TV off the wall, his movements frantic and clumsy. He hadn't seen Mark yet. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was no longer about neighborhood squabbles. This was real danger. My son was willingly putting himself in the path of it. The burglar finally wrestled the TV free and turned, catching sight of Brenda for the first time. He let out a startled curse and dropped the television with a crash. At that exact moment Mark made his move. He kicked the front door with such force that the frame splintered, the door flying inward and slamming against the wall. "Sheriff's Department, drop to the ground, now!" Mark's voice was a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of Brenda's immaculate house. The masked man panicked. He spun around, saw the uniformed officer filling the doorway, and made a desperate choice. Instead of surrendering, he bolted for the back of the house. I heard the sound of a sliding glass door being wrenched open, followed by Mark shouting, "Subject is fleeing, heading towards the backyard." I saw Mark disappear into the house. The sirens started then, a distant wail that grew closer with each passing second. Dave and Ricky stood beside me, their earlier amusement replaced with grim concern. "Your son's a real hero, man," Dave muttered, his eyes wide. The next few minutes were a blur of organized chaos. The two officers who had been at my house earlier were the first to arrive back on the scene, their faces set with grim determination. They drew their weapons and followed Mark's path into the house, securing the scene. More cars followed, sealing off the cul-de-sac. An officer came over to us, making sure we were okay and taking a preliminary statement. I explained what we saw, my voice shaky. All I could think about was Mark. Was he okay? Had the burglar been armed? The wait was agonizing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark emerged from the side of Brenda's house, walking alongside another officer. Between them, hands cuffed securely behind his back, was the burglar, his ski mask now pulled off to reveal the face of a young man, probably not much older than Ricky. He looked terrified. Mark was unharmed, not even a scratch on him, just a smudge of dirt on his uniform pants from where he'd likely jumped her back fence. A wave of relief so powerful it made my knees weak washed over me. He saw me watching and gave me a short, reassuring nod before continuing to debrief the other officers. Paramedics arrived and went inside to check on Brenda. A few minutes later they emerged with her, wrapped in a shock blanket, her face ashen and streaked with tears. She looked utterly broken. As they guided her toward the ambulance, her eyes found mine. There was no smugness left, no arrogance, no petty tyranny. There was only a hollow, shell-shocked fear. She knew. She understood that while she was busy inventing a crime, a real one could have cost her everything. Her frantic, malicious 911 call had, by a bizarre twist of fate, brought the exact person she needed to the scene at the exact moment she needed him. If Mark hadn't been there, if he hadn't been standing on my lawn when she screamed, the thought was chilling. The commotion eventually died down. The burglar was taken away. Brenda was taken to the hospital to be checked for shock. The movers, after giving their statements, looked at me. "You want us to, keep going, Mr. Miller?" Ricky asked tentatively. I looked at the half-empty house, at the waiting truck, at my son who was now walking back towards me, his duty done. "Yeah," I said, a sense of finality settling over me. "Yeah, let's finish this." Mark came and stood with me on the lawn, watching as Dave and Ricky resumed their work, the rhythm of the move starting up again. "Someday, huh?" he said, letting out a long, weary sigh. "You have no idea," I replied, clapping him on the back. "Mark, thank you. For everything. What you did today. You were amazing." He just shrugged, though I could see the pride in his eyes. "Just doing my job, Dad." He looked across the street at Brenda's house, now cordoned off with police tape. "I guess she finally had a legitimate reason to call the cops." We shared a dark laugh. "Think she'll be filing any more complaints about your parking?" I asked. "I have a feeling Brenda is going to be keeping a very, very low profile from now on," he said, with a wry smile. "I waived the charges for the false report. I think today was probably punishment enough." He was right. As the movers loaded the last box onto the truck, I took one final look at the house I had called home for 35 years. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they were joined by the fresh, vivid memory of the day's events. It was a chaotic, terrifying, and strangely cathartic end to this chapter of my life. I was leaving behind a neighborhood ruled by a petty tyrant, but I had been reminded of what truly mattered, the calm, unwavering courage of my son. As I climbed into my car to follow the moving truck to my new life, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I opened it. "Thank you. I am so sorry. For everything." It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. I didn't reply. I just put the car in drive, leaving the cul-de-sac, the drama, and Brenda behind for good. A new chapter was waiting, and for the first time, I felt truly ready to start it.